Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Virtual Kant Congress with a cosmopolitan purpose. And today we have a special session because it is a group that covers two groups in two different countries. So it is the Argentinian Kant group and the Chilean Kant group, and they merged especially to this Congress. So we are looking forward to the discussions. Hernan Pringe, professor of philosophy in the University of Buenos Aires and in the University of Diego Portales in Chile, is the person who brought these two groups together, and he put together the session, and he will be chairing today. So thank you so much, Hernan, for putting the session together. We are very much looking forward to it. And just a quick reminder before we start, after the session, we usually keep the Zoom meeting open for informal discussions after the recording stops. So everyone is welcome to stay. And yes, and without further ado, I will just hand it over to Hernan. Thank you so much, Hernan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luis. Thank you very much for the organization of this wonderful meeting. Today, as you said, we will be here as two very close related Kantian groups. So we will have three different conferences. The first two of them will have comments by other members of the group. And the first conference will be held by Laura Pellegrin. She's a postdoctoral researcher in the Kantian Study Group at the University of Buenos Aires. She received her PhD from Leiden University and University Diego Portales with a dissertation on the philosophy of Paul Natorp, and she will present us a work on Mario Caimi's interpretation of Kantian philosophy. So, Laura.
Well, I will share my screen. Yeah. Okay. Mario Caimi's interpretation of Kant, his interpretation of the transcendental aesthetic and transcendental logic. Mario Caimi, this is an interview. It is said that when they finally opened a hole in the wall of Tutankhamun, Lord Carnarvon peered through it, and someone asking what he saw inside, he replied with a phrase that could have been said by any scholar of Kantian philosophy: wonderful things. Introduction. In 1882, Mario Caimi published Kant's doctrine of sensation in the Critique of Pure Reason, an attempt at the reconstruction of eclectic theory of pure knowledge. This book, the product of his doctoral research and the direction of Gerhard Funke, marks the beginning of Caimi's interpretation of Kant's critical system. Caimi presents various investigations in which he explores different aspects of Kantian philosophy. Certainly, Caimi's reading has evolved over the years. Nevertheless, we will argue there are elements in his research that are maintained throughout his academic career. The aim of this investigation is to present Mario Caimi's reading of the transcendental aesthetic and transcendental logic. In particular, we will exhibit the common thread that guides Caimi's study of the different sections of the Critique of Pure Reason, and highlight the elements that are maintained throughout his investigation. Our hypothesis is that Caimi's reading has as its common thread the problem of method. We argue that the synthetic nature of philosophical method provides the main key to his interpretation of the Critique of Pure Reason. Second, we will show that Caimi reads these sections of the critique as an explanation of how thought relates to reality. The problem of method is the guide to answer this question. We will show that two other aspects that run through his reading are understood as a function of his mode of approach. First, the rejection of a psychologistic interpretation of Kant's work. Secondly, the effort to show the relevance of the dialectic moment in the different sections of the critique. The research consists on 4 parts, First, we will briefly analyze the nature of the synthetic method according to Caim's reading. Second, we will study his interpretation of the transcendental aesthetic, attending mainly to the problem of sensation. Third, we will present Caim's reading of the metaphysical deduction and transcendental deduction. Finally, we will analyze Caim's investigation of transcendental schematism. 2. Synthetic method. The problem of method is the common thread of Caim's interpretation of the critique of pure reason. Caim argues that in order to understand the evolution of the critique and the argumentative structure of its different sections, it is necessary to attend to the method used by Kant. The synthetic method is the guiding thread of the Kantian research. In the Prolegomena, Kant argues that the method of philosophy is synthetic while that of mathematics is analytic. The analytic method consists in starting from a given knowledge and searching for its condition of possibility. In this sense, it is a regressive method. The problem of a regressive method is that it is based on the assumption, and I quote, that what is sought is real and existent, end of the quote. The method of philosophy is synthetic. Philosophy, unlike mathematics, does not start from definitions. On the contrary, the philosophical method starts from an obscure and confused concept with an indeterminate origin that one seeks to clarify. The method progresses by isolating, analyzing, and finally integrating the elements. For the reason, this method is progressive. The organic nature of reason allows this operation. The synthetic method proceeds, and I quote, from the distinguishable elements in a confused concept to the clear and distinct reconstruction of that concept. It does not presuppose anything, but rather demonstrates the necessity of each step it advances and of each new element it introduces, end of the quote. Therefore, each element introduced, I quote, is methodologically necessary and strictly required by the previous steps of investigation, end of the quote. In what follows, we will show that Caim adopts the problem of method as the common thread of his reading of the different sections of the critique of pure reason. 3. The reading of the transcendental aesthetic and the investigation of the material conditions of knowledge. The first step of the synthetic method consists in starting from an obscure and confused concept. The first concept we have is that of representation in general. The argumentation of the transcendental aesthetic begins with this zero moment, representation. According to Caim, I quote, to this concept of representation, the method of isolation is applied, and with it the whole argumentation of the work begins, end of the quote. This initial moment originates from sensation, and more specifically with affection. Affection is a starting point of argumentation since it provides the matter of knowledge. By virtue of affection, we have sensible representations. The fact that we have this sensible representation marks the beginning of the inquiry. For Caim, Kant's argumentative strategy consists in clarifying this concept, which is presented at the beginning in an obscure and confused way. In the first paragraph of the Aesthetic, Kant introduces sensation as a constitutive element of representation and proposes that the space and time are pure forms of sensible intuition. The hypothesis with which he ends paragraph 1 continues in paragraph 2. For Caim, the definitive proof that space and time are forms of sensibility is found in the second conclusion. The task of the aesthetic is accomplished by demonstrating that the space and time are the candidates that satisfy the condition for being a priori forms of sensibility. For Caim, the discovery of space and time as forms of intuition has three results. First, insofar as space is an a priori intuition, the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments of mathematics is explained. Second, mathematics can legitimately be applied to the phenomena of experience because space is a form of intuition. Finally, the most important result consists in establishing that the objects of experience are phenomena and not things in themselves. Thus, Caim proposes two theses regarding the scope of the transcendental aesthetic. Negatively, the aesthetic does not contain a doctrine of space and time. Kant's aim is to show that space and time are forms of sensibility. Positively, the aesthetic substantiates the possibility of the applicability of mathematics to nature. Caim knows that the synthetic method has not been left as a result that we have pure forms of sensibility, but also reveals that there is an element in the representation that the subject does not contribute, matter. Caim has dwelt on an aspect not always well pondered, the relevance of the material conditions of experience. Although the most thorough study of this aspect is to be found in his early research, it is a problem that runs through his philosophical production. In 1982, Mario Caim published the book Kant's Doctrine of Sensation in the Critique of Pure Reason, an attempt at the reconstruction of aesthetic theory of pure knowledge. In his work, Caim introduces some of the distinctive elements of his reading of Kant. We find in this study several of the characteristics of his interpretation that are maintained throughout his academic career. But Caim's aim is to recover the aesthetic element of the critical system. In his research, he sees the relevance of the material conditions of experience. The material conditions of experience are as necessary as the formal conditions. While matter given to sensibility does not ground any necessity of knowledge, I quote, nevertheless, without this condition, no knowledge would be possible, end of the quote. Matter is not a condition of possibility of synthetic a priori judgments. Nevertheless, matter is a necessary condition of experience. Therefore, one of the tasks of critical system is to investigate matter as a necessary condition of knowledge itself, since, along with the formal condition, there is a material condition without which neither experience nor knowledge would be possible. Second, Caimi rejects a psychologistic interpretation of the problem of sensation. The problem Kant addresses is not the genesis of representation in the consciousness of empirical subjects. Caimi argues that the critical system must investigate sensation as a part of transcendental structure of knowledge. For Caimi, sensation is not to be understood as a modification in the mind of the empirical subject, but in the subject of knowledge. The concept of subjectivity is only introduced as a requirement to clarify the problem of experience. The path of investigation leads to the necessity of introducing this element. Transcendental philosophy only studies sensation from this point of view. Sensation is not a phenomenon of empirical subjective consciousness, but a necessary structural moment of the theory of knowledge. For this reason, its role must be highlighted by analyzing its function within the system. Caimi explains that the infallibility of the criterion of sensation is the concept of the dualism between understanding and sensibility that arises from the recognition of our finitude. He argues that the reference of sensation to matter is a necessary corollary of the peculiar way in which Kant conceives the finitude of our understanding. The human understanding cannot create the object materialiter. The finitude of the mind and its necessary reference to sensibility also affects the peculiar way in which Kant conceives understanding. In general, the heterogeneity between understanding and sensibility is a concept of finitude. According to the Kantian conception, the reference of understanding to objects can only be given by sensation. Empirical intuition is the condition of knowledge in the strict sense, and sensation is the condition of all empirical intuition. Thus, from the obscure and confused concept of representation, we arrive at the result that we have forms of sensibility, space and time. It also became clear that there is an element that the mind does not provide, matter. Time explains, I quote, "The representation of indeterminate origin is thus the first thing that is given to us. To it, we apply our method of isolation, and that enables us to distinguish a matter from it and a form," end of the quote. Kant arrives at these results from the application of the synthetic method, which, as we shall see, is also the guiding thread of the transcendental analytic. For transcendental analytic, Caimi considers that method is the common thread of both the metaphysical deduction and transcendental deduction. Metaphysical exposition follows the synthetic method. Transcendental aesthetic left as a result that the mind possesses a passive faculty by virtue of which it perceives representation. The analysis of sensibility leads to the necessity of introducing another function that accounts for the way in which the multiplicity of given representations must be brought together. Since sensibility is passive, another faculty is required, the understanding. The understanding is introduced, I quote, because it is demanded what has been examined so far, sensibility, end of the quote. The method demands metaphysical deduction because it has to be shown that there is an action that allows multiplicity to be taken as a unity. The action that makes this activity possible is synthesis. For this reason, Caimi argues that the concept of synthesis explains the systematic place of metaphysical deduction. In his reading of metaphysical deduction, the same motives that we observed above stand out. The synthetic method is the guide to understanding the task of the metaphysical deduction. Caimi rejects a psychologistic interpretation. The deduction does not require any psychological or anthropological consideration. There is no observation of the processes of the mind. Each concept is introduced by requirement of the method. The synthetic method leaves as a result of the metaphysical deductions that we have concepts of understanding. The concepts of understanding are empty, must have a reference to sensibility in order to have content. However, this reference is not guaranteed. Transcendental logic cannot dispense with content as formal logic can't. Overcoming heterogeneity between sensibility and understanding in order to be content to concepts and guide to intuitions will drive the investigation of the transcendental deduction. The problem of method is also the guiding thread of the transcendental deduction. Having shown that we have pure concepts of understanding, it is necessary to prove that they can refer to objects. For Caimi, the question answered by the transcendental deduction is how pure thought can relate to things. The metaphysical deduction showed that we have pure concepts that arise from understanding. Now it is necessary to exhibit that these concepts can be related to objects. Kaimi argues that the peculiarity of this problem within the framework of the Kantian philosophy lies in the way Kant conceives the nature of concepts or understanding. On the one hand, this relationship is not a problem for empirism, since concepts obtain their content from the data of experience. On the other hand, it's not a problem if the content of the concept is living along with its form. The problem of the relationship between concepts and their objects arises from the peculiar Kantian conception of concepts. Kaimi shows that one of the novelties of Kant's system is the introduction of empty concepts. Providing content to concepts that are essentially empty is a novel problem. Kant has an innovative view of the notion of concepts. I quote, "In the concept of empty concept, we found one of the fundamental ideas of critical philosophy," end of the quote. Kaimi asserts, I quote, "Therefore, a concept can be empty and still impeccable according to formal logical criteria. This is because it can be empty in this new way, as it may lack a corresponding intuition. Kant's achievement, his innovation in Leibniz's Wolffian philosophy emerges here. It consists in recognizing intuition as a necessary condition for knowledge. This brings with it the recognition of the insufficiency of understanding as the sole source of knowledge," end of the quote. Transcendental deduction faces this peculiar problem: how to endow with content the concepts that arise from understanding and which are therefore essentially empty and heterogeneous with respect to content. This is a negative aim of transcendental deduction, I quote, "to show the pure concepts of an understanding are not empty concepts," end of the quote. To accomplish this task, Kant follows the synthetic method. At this point, the principle of apperception with its mode of synthesis is the obscure and confused concept that is taken as a starting point. The development of transcendental deduction is aimed at enriching this principle through the synthetic method. According to Kaimi, transcendental deduction develops in 3 stages. The first stage, from paragraph 15 to 20, begins with the general concept of combination and culminates with the necessary reference of concept to an object in general. In this section, the personal character of the unit of apperception is introduced. According to Kaimi, the I thing cannot have an impersonal status. Self-consciousness fulfills the role of preventing the dispersion of the self into multiple selves. In this sense, the concept of apperception includes and clarifies the unity of the I thing, for it points out that synthesis is the act of, I quote, "the always identical and unique self-consciousness of an active self," end of the quote. Then, the unity of the self is a logical, that is to say, methodological requirement. Kaimi exhibits how Kant reformulates the concept of objectivity here. This reformulation allows him to distinguish between the mere association of subjective representation and the object. The reformulation of the notion of objectivity is based on the distinction between the subjective synthesis synopsis and the objective synthesis which the understanding produces. The objective synthesis is regulated by the rules of understanding and I quote, "insofar as it is ruled by the principle of the unity of consciousness, cannot be an arbitrary one ruled by any concept whatsoever that we might happen to choose, but is the only synthesis whose necessity we have succeeded in establishing," end of the quote. The second stage is developed from paragraph 21 to 25. Here, the notion of time and imagination as a function of the understandings are introduced in order to explain the relationship of understanding with sensibility. The first part of the deduction showed that the categories can be applied to objects in general. However, the object of experience is not only shaped by the laws of objectivity, but includes an aspect that neither understanding nor the formalism of sensibility contributes: matter. Matter is the product of affection. To show the legitimate relation between thought and object, it must be proved that categories have reference to existing objects. Therefore, I quote, "the next step of the deduction must lead to the integration of this new element, the affection, into the unity of apperception," end of the quote. The principle of apperception is enriched synthetically. The analysis of perception cannot give us a relation with a new element. At this stage, the progress of the investigation demands a new element which is introduced synthetically. The matter provided by the affection is the only index of the existence of the object. Only by showing the relation of the categories to sensation can it be proved that these concepts are not empty. In view of the conjugation of these heterogeneous elements, the faculty of imagination is introduced. The function of imagination is not to be interpreted as a psychological sense. Imagination is understanding itself when applied to sensibility, and it is introduced as a methodological requirement to explain the relation of the understanding to the matter of affection. In this way, the problem of the deduction is solved. The categories are not empty concepts whose function is to think, but concepts with possible objective references. The categories are functions of knowledge of objects. Finally, in the third stage, it is shown that the concepts of understanding apply not only to objects, but to nature as a whole. In this section, the Copernican revolution is consummated, for it is shown that the rules of synthesis of understanding are valid with respect to objects of nature and I quote, not only with regard to understanding itself and to its representations, end of the quote. In this way, Caimi proves his thesis. I quote, the whole transcendental V deduction is constituted in an extremely coherent way as a statement of a single principle, and as a synthetic enrichment of it. One can go through the argumentation, reading it as an increasingly richer and more differentiated formulations of the principle of a perception, which Kant introduces at the beginning of paragraph 16. The reading of Caimi's transcendental deduction exhibits the elements we highlighted in the introduction. First, the synthetic method is the common thread of his interpretation. Each element is introduced by a logical necessity resulting from method. Secondly, Caimi rejects any kind of psychological or anthropological interpretation. Kant does not address the problem of the generation of representation and empirical consciousness. There is no analysis of psychological faculties of the mind. Third, Caimi exhibits that one of the problems solved by the critical system is the relation between being and thinking, and more specifically, the problem of incorporating the material element into the concepts of understanding, which are by essence empty. 5. Transcendental schematism. For Caimi, schematism has a task of its own, different from that of the deduction. The task of schematism is neither repetitive nor superfluous, as many interpreters consider. In schematism, the problem is no longer the determination of the conditions of objectivity by the subsumption of the given singular object to the a priori conditions of subjectivity. The object at issue here is not the object in general, but the particular empirical object given to intuition. The object given to intuition must be subsumed to the conditions imposed by thought. The function of schematism is, and I quote, to allow the subsumption of empirically given phenomena under the categories, even if such phenomena are not similar, but not homogeneous, but heterogeneous to categories, end of the quote. The problem is not to establish the conditions of objectivity, but to show how the given object can be subsumed under these conditions. The given object is alien to the mind. It possesses determination that the mind does not provide. Then the problem is how to subsume this object under the conditions imposed by subjectivity. For this reason, the task of schematism consists in exhibiting the way in which the individual objects of nature that are given to the senses can be subsumed under the conditions of thought. This task involves a change in the point of view, whereas in the analytic of concept, the term object means the object in general. In the analytic of principles, the term refers to the single concrete object given to intuition. Caimi argues that it is understandable that the chapter of schematism belongs to analytic of principles and not to analytic of concepts. The subsumption effected by the faculty of judgment allows empirical objects to be linked to the fundamental principles of nature, set forth in the system of principles. Mario Caimi's reading of schematism is developed along the lines discussed in the introduction. Caimi rejects a psychologistic interpretation. The procedure of imagination is not to be understood as an operation of the mind of the empirical subject. The problem of imagination as a faculty of the mind of the individual is treated in anthropology from a pragmatic point of view. On the contrary, in the critique, imagination is introduced as a function that makes knowledge possible. Similarly, schemas are not representation in the mind of the individual, but universal procedures that allow to put concepts into images, and thus to subsume the given object to concepts. Thus, also in the chapter of schematism, the problem of the given object is introduced. Consequently, sensation occupies a central place in this section. Caimi warns that sensation does not have a psychological sense. A psychological interpretation, I quote, would not do justice to the epistemological intention of the text, end of the quote. Secondly, the problem of method is the main thread running through Caimi's reading. On the one hand, schematism is introduced by strictly methodological necessity into the system of principles. Schematism solves a problem left open by the analytic of concepts. On the other hand, schematism lays the foundation for the introduction of the system of principles. Finally, Caimi's reading of schematism reflects a motive present in his 1982 research to determine the relation of the conditions of experience with what the mind does not produce. Incorporating the given object into the conditions of experience is a task that the system must explain. Caimi makes it clear that the problem of sensation and of the material conditions of experience is presented as a central problem of the schematism chapter. In his reading of the section, Caimi exhibits the determining role of sensation and consequently of the matter of affection. First, I quote, because it is only through sensation that we can recognize empirical qualities. Second, sensation attests to the presence of something in the sense of its existence or reality, end of the quote. Thus, in the chapter of schematism, Kant explains how the singular object given to intuition must be subsumed to the condition imposed by thought and thus answer the problem on the relation between thought and reality. Conclusion. We have shown that the problem of method is the common thread in Marius Caimi's reading of the Critique of Pure Reason. We exhibited that Caimi interpreted this section of Kant's work as an answer to the question about the relation between being and thinking, using the problem of method as a key to address this question. This approach allowed us to reveal two other aspects of his interpretation, the rejection of psychologistic interpretation of Kant and the effort to highlight the relevance of the dialectic moment in the various sections of the critique. On the shoulders of Kant and with the methods as a reluctant thread, Professor Caimi addresses one of the fundamental questions of philosophy, how thought can refer to reality.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much. Well, now we have a second part of this first section that will be some comments made by Martín Obreque on this text by Laura. Martín is a PhD student at the University Diego Portales in Chile, and he holds an MA in Contemporary Thought from this university. He's currently developing his dissertation on the problem of a genetic method in transcendental philosophy from Kant to Fichte. So now I give Martín the word.
Thank you very much, Hernan. Yeah, I go straight to my comments. Laura Pellegrin, in a clear and substantive way, illuminates Mario Caimi's reading of Kant based on the guiding thread of the methodological question. Method, then, is the key to interpreting the investigation of pure reason and, in turn, clarifying the methodological synthesis between aesthetics and logic as an investigation into the legitimate relationship that pure reason can establish between being and thinking. With this, we can discuss psychologistic interpretations and also highlight the electric moment or the necessity of sensation for objective knowledge. Now, this interpretative framework opens up a number of questions regarding the method in Kant that I'm content to raise in these comments in the hope to discuss with you in this session or on another occasion. I will pose 3 questions and add a minimal characterization to each. First, is it only the method synthetic, or is the object of the method itself also a synthesis? Put differently, does it not seem to you that what the synthesis of the method synthesizes is itself a synthesis? Caimi has excellently described the steps or stages of the Kantian synthetic method by, roughly speaking, integrating the starting point of an skewed concept, the analytical moments of isolation and separate study of the elements, and finally, the integration of elements into a systematic and integral synthesis that defines that concept from which it started. Now, if it's seen from the relation between aesthetic and logic, between receptivity and spontaneity, it would seem that the very result of the synthetic method is the discovery and characterization of a spontaneous activity of the subject of cognition. So, is it not only the method that is synthetic, but also the very object of transcendental philosophy to explain the synthetic, or spontaneous activity of the subject of cognition? Secondly, with the methodological interpretation, what about the relation between metaphysics and critique to which the prologues of the Critique of Pure Reason aspire? Does the synthetic method enable a corresponding metaphysics? And in what sense would such a metaphysics be synthetic? Or, if the synthetic method is insufficient to ground a metaphysic, is there another method that corresponds to metaphysics? From the perspective of aesthetics and logic, the metaphysical domain, whether dogmatic or practical, seems to remain unattended. In this respect, it seems to me an interesting pending task to establish what is the link between the synthetic method and the system of reason as a whole, including there the practical parts of philosophy and the more strongly speculative dimension of the dialectic. Third, and finally, how does this thread of the problem of method allow us to interpret Kant's reception? You probably know that Kant himself described his critique of pure reason as a treatise on method. With this, critical philosophy seems to be a meta-philosophical inquiry into the task and purpose of philosophy itself, or an inquiry of reason into itself. Considering that, one could interpret the reception of Kant and the subsequent formulations of transcendental philosophy from its methodological transformations. Perhaps, if we trace the methodological turns or shifts or transformations, this approach would be useful to understand, for example, why Maimon's transcendental philosophy, with his theory of differentials, has considerably different results from Kant's, perhaps closer to mathematics than to philosophy in the Kantian sense. Or more interestingly, what can we say about the synthetic method with Fichte? Fichte has claimed that his system is basically identical to Kant's, that he arrives at the same results but by completely different methodological routes. Now, if we take into account that Kant described his critique as a treatise on method, wouldn't changing the method mean completely changing transcendental philosophy? The methodological transformation from Kant to Fichte are diverse, but one that perhaps is key is that Fichte adds to his synthetic method the appellation or adjective genetic. Or, on this basis, I think it would be substantive to ask, what is the difference between Kant's synthetic method and Fichte's synthetic genetic method, and how does this methodological difference give rise to different systems of philosophy? In sum, I hope that these three questions about synthesis as the object of the method, the relation between metaphysics and synthetic method, and last methodological transformations in the reception of Kant may be fertile for further discussions or research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much. So we will go on with the presentations and we will have questions and comments right at the end. So the second presentation will be by Alejandra Bahan. She has a PhD from the Alberto Hurtado University, and she is currently working as an adjunct professor at the same university. She is a member of our critical studies or critical idealism group, and she will give us a talk on the regulative idea of the soul. So please, Alejandra.
Thank you, Hernan. I changed a little bit the title of the presentation, but it's basically the same topic, so I expect it's not a problem. Well, I will then proceed to read. The regulative idea of the soul in the appendix of the transcendental dialectic and its enrichment through the analysis of natural ends in the Critique of Pure Reason. In a famous passage in the introduction to the first critique, Kant argues for the possibility of a common root of the faculties of knowledge, unknown to us. This passage seems to suggest at least the suspicion of an original unity underlying the various faculties. Indeed, the problem of the unity of the faculties was not foreign to the philosophical debate of Kant's contemporaries. Christian Wolff, following the Leibnizian tradition, proposes that the soul possesses a basic or fundamental power of representation, a vis representativa universi. Kant, however, seems skeptical about the possibility of reducing the various faculties to a common one. Indeed, in a remarkable passage into the introduction of the third critique, he points out that the quest, I quote, to introduce unity into the diversity of the faculties, though undertaken in a truly philosophical spirit, is in vain. Do Kant's words imply that we must abandon the investigation of the unity of the subject and its faculty altogether? In what follows, I would like to argue that is not the case. But in order to provide an answer to this problem, it is necessary to go deeper into the kind of unity that is under discussion when we think about the unity of the faculties. In this context, both the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic in the Critique of Pure Reason and the analysis of the characteristic of natural ends in the Critique of Judgment contains two different but complementary models of the way in which we can think of the unity that governs the subject and its faculties. I will begin by considering two ways in which Kant poses the problem of the regulative idea on the psychological sphere. First, as the regulative idea of the soul, and then as the idea of a fundamental power. I am interested in emphasizing that beyond the difference, in these both cases, we are dealing with the same kind of unity, namely the systematic unity which reason demands to introduce into an empirical multiplicity. Finally, I will briefly describe the main features of the organic teleological model proper to natural ends, and then show how this model is analogous to the model of the regulative idea and in what sense it enriches it. The regulative idea of the soul, developed in the appendix, presents itself as a suitable candidate for answering the question of the unity of the subject and its faculties. The kind of unity introduced by the regulative idea requires precisely that the different faculties and their representations be thought of as a unity, the unity of a systematically organized totality. Thus, in the context of the regulative use of ideas, Kant recognizes the necessity of thinking, at least hypothetically, the unity of the representations of inner sense under the regulative idea of the soul. This, since in the chapter of the paralogism of pure reason, the possibility of knowing the soul as an object of inner sense has been rejected. The unity of the regulative idea is therefore not the unity of an object of knowledge, but the kind of unity which reason demands, but which lacks cognitive scope or cognitive application. Here, the context is given by the definition of a hypothetical use of reason, the scope of which would not be determinative as in its apodictic use, but merely regulative. In the case of the hypothetical use of reason, we have only a problematically conceived concept, that is, an idea of reason. The function of the idea in this case is determined by the systematic claim of reason itself, for it's by means of the idea that we can orientate reflection on the diversity of inner representations. This means that the unity of the diverse representations of inner sense can only be projected as an orientation for reflection. Kant claims, and I quote, "We will first, in psychology, connect all appearances, actions, and receptivity of our mind to the guiding thread of inner experience, as if the mind were a simple substance that, at least in this life, persists in existence with both identity, while its states Zustände to which the states of the body belong, only as external conditions, are continuously changing. In this passage, Kant understands the regulative idea of the soul as a heuristic tool that allows us to think of the unity of all internal phenomena, as if we were dealing with a substance and its accidents. It is noteworthy that the function of the regulative idea as a guide for reflecting on empirical diversity, introducing the systematic unity demanded by reason, is very similar to the function developed by the reflective faculty of judgment and its principle of purposiveness in the Critique of Judgment. Nevertheless, in the quoted passages, Kant seems to be concerned with the necessity of thinking the soul as if it was an object. In other words, it is as if the soul, although we know that it cannot be regarded as an object of knowledge, can only be thought of by analogy with the way in which we think of objects. Now, in addition to the idea of the soul in the appendix, we also find an explicit reference to the problem of the unity of the faculties and the possibility of finding a common root or fundamental power that allows the diversity to be unified. In this context, Kant uses this problem to show how reason naturally seeks unity in the diversity that constitute the mental faculties. In Kant's own words, I quote, "Now there is a logical maxim which requires that we should reduce, so far as may be possible, the seemingly different diversity by comparing these with one another and detecting their hidden identity. Though logic is not capable of deciding whether a fundamental power, Grundkraft, actually exists, the idea of such a power is the problem involved in a general systematic representation of the multiplicity of power." In this passage, Kant introduces the notion of fundamental power to account for reason's need to think of the systematic unity of a diversity of faculties, even if only hypothetically. The point is to think of the mind as a multiplicity of powers that reason requires to be compared and, as far as possible, reduced to a single fundamental power. For Kant, the concept of force, Kraft, it is a predicable, that is, a derived concept resulting from the combination of the category of substance and that of causality. In this sense, we speak of a force when we think of a substance which, as cause, produces effects. In other words, the force is the expression of the causality of a substance in relation to the modification of another substance or to the modification of the accidents of another substance. In the case of the mind, the same substance is both the ground of causality and of its effects. The variety of representations produced by the different faculties would then be the result of the causality of a thinking substance. That is to say that we will think of the mind as if it was an object of knowledge, as if the totality of the faculties correspond to a substance whose accidents are thoughts. In this sense, the difference between the idea of a fundamental power and that of the soul corresponds not so much to the way in which the mind is conceived, but to the diversity which is to be unified by means of an idea. In the case of the fundamental power, what we are trying to unify are the faculties of the mind, considered as if they correspond to different acts of the same substance, about which, however, we cannot say anything. In the case of the idea of the soul, on the other hand, it is a matter of considering the variety of phenomena of inner sense as belonging to one and the same subject, regulatively considered as a substance. In both cases, we think of the subject as if it was a substance with accidents, that is, by analogy with the way in which we think of objects of experience. What is more important, however, is the fact that in both cases, we are dealing with the same kind of unity, namely a systematic hypothetical unity of merely regulative scope, that is, a guide or orientation for reflection on a certain empirical diversity. Let me briefly explain why this is important. In the Architectonic of Pure Reason, Kant defines what he means by systematic unity by analogy with an animal body. Systematic unity is the unity of a multiplicity of knowledge
Alejandra?
Is apparently offline.
Sorry?
Yeah, I don't know if it was my connection or your connection, but it suddenly stopped.
We lost you.
Yes, Alejandra.
No, I think it's the problem of her connection.
So it is not just me, no?
No, it's
No,
her.
no,
No. It was
Okay,
general.
okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. So you can go on.
It seems that my connection is not the best. Should I proceed now? Can you hear me
Yes,
well?
please. Please, yes.
Okay. The systematic unity, by analogy with an animal body, this systematic unity is the unity of a multiplicity of knowledge under one idea, an idea which is not a mere aggregate of unconnected parts of
Maybe you should you may try by not but not by
analogies.
using your video, please.
You can take off the camera.
Okay.
Yeah.
Without the camera, maybe it's better the connection.
Turn it off and maybe it will work. Yeah. Alejandra, are you here?
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So go ahead.
Okay, please. Yes.
Thank you. Well, analogous to the teleological, sorry, I was in this code. Consequently, analogous to the teleological order that we can observe in natural ends, the systematic unity that the model of the regulative idea seeks to introduce presupposes a teleological order of the faculties that constitute the subject's mind. In this context, the critical judgment constitutes a fundamental base to approach what would be the systematic unity of the faculties and their teleological arrangement. In fact, teleology, or more precisely, the principle of purposiveness, runs through both the aesthetic and teleology of the faculty of judgment. I will begin with the latter and then observe how teleology is expressed in the sphere of the subject and its anemic life in the aesthetics. The view that Kant conceived of the unity of the faculties according to a teleological model analogous to that which operates in the natural end has attracted the attention of an eminent Venezuelan researcher, Alberto Rosales, who points out that Kant conceived of the unity of the faculties in terms of their internal connection and the kind of systematic unity that governs them. I quote, such as that which governs in the natural end, in organisms. But what is that characterize natural ends? Due to time constraints, I will briefly address two aspects of Kant analysis of natural end. First, its systematic organization and internal teleology of circular character, and finally, its formative power. In paragraphs 64 and 65 of the Critique of the Teleological Judgment, Kant discusses in detail the specific characteristic of the kind of internal organization implied in natural ends. In this context, Kant points out that natural ends are, I quote, cause and effect of themselves. This implies that natural ends are first and foremost organized beings. since we can observe in their forms a certain order or configuration which takes the explanation according to causal laws of the understanding to its extreme, and in turn claims an explanation according to ends. In this sense, Kant says, and I quote, "For a thing as a natural end, it is requisite first that its part
Alejandra?
of quote. This passage underlines the fact that the peculiar order we observe in natural ends involves first a special kind of relation between the whole and the parts. The parts of a natural end do not constitute a mere aggregate, but an organized totality. Therefore, the order and systematic connection between the parts must already be determined in accordance with the concept of the idea of the whole. Consequently, it is the idea of an organized totality that determines both the arrangement of the parts and the kind of connection that is established between them. In other words, when we observe a verb, for example, we do not regard it as a mere aggregate or heap of matter, in which its parts are merely attached to one another. On the contrary, its parts are determined in function of each other, and each of the parts is determined in function of the whole. In fact, in the natural end, the thing itself is an end. And in this sense, the end is not external to the thing as in the case of an artifact, but internal to it. But the scope of teleology is limited to the sphere of reflection, so the unity of the natural end is not a unity that determines any object of knowledge, and even less should lead us to attribute intentionality to nature itself. Finally, one of the most striking characteristics of natural ends is that they possess what Kant calls formative power, that is, the capacity to give themselves a teleological order. It is the ability of living things to introduce a kind of primitive formation and thus to organize matter that would otherwise have no organization at all. This is evident when we look at the way in which natural ends can organize or form themselves in processes such as reproduction and preservation of the species, growth, and nutrition. Now, as Goy argues, for Kant, I quote, "The formative force is a fundamental natural power, immaterial and internal to the organism. Certainly, as an immaterial property and internal to the natural end, formative power is inscrutable to our discursive understanding. And for this reason, Kant argues that, I quote, very little is said of nature and its products when it's called analogous to art, and we would come closer to this property if we were to call it analogous to life." By analogy with the teleological model, with the organic teleological model, the systematic unity of the regulative idea also implies that the faculties of the mind and their respective representations conform an organized totality in which each faculty performs a function in relation to the totality of the subject's mind. Now, to better understand in what sense the unity of the faculties of the mind forms a systematically organized whole, we must first consider their a priori connection or relations. If the mind is a whole, has an order, then this order must be necessary and not merely contingent. Otherwise, we would have only a mere aggregate of parts and not a system. In this context, the two introductions to the critique of judgment are extremely illustrative, since there Kant presents a table in which he compares the faculties of the mind in general with the higher faculties of cognition and their respective a priori principles. That is the table that Kant presents. From this comparison, it can be clear that among the faculties of the mind, only the higher faculties of cognition contain a priori principles that can be given to itself and to other faculties. In fact, the higher cognitive faculties are the origin of the a priori principles that govern the faculties of the mind in general, that is, as a whole. Thus, while the understanding contains the a priori principles of lawfulness, which determines the faculty of cognition and limits its cognitive claim to the realm of nature, likewise, pure reason is the origin of a kind of a priori legality that imposes itself as a duty for the faculty of desire, namely the moral law, which in turn grounds the possibility of a metaphysics of morals. To this scheme, the critique of judgment adds the faculty of reflective judgment, which occupies an intermediate place between understanding and reason, and which also gives rise to an a priori principle capable of determining the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, which in turn mediates between the faculty of knowledge, of cognition, and the faculty of desire. So, the critical analysis of the faculties is thus complete, since it is possible to establish an a priori connection that had not been noticed before, that is, between the faculty of judgment and the feeling of pleasure. In this sense, and by analogy with the natural end, we can say that the faculty of judgment and the feeling of pleasure behaves as part of a totality that is connected to each other by means of a priori principles. In other words, the system of the faculty and whose connection is determined according to a priori principles. But in what sense can we say that the system of the mind implies an internal teleology analogous to that of natural ends? To answer this question, we must consider the relationship between the faculty of judgment and its a priori determination of the feeling of pleasure. That is the case of the pure judgment of taste, which Kant addresses in the aesthetic of the faculty of judgment. In paragraph 9 of the Aesthetics, Kant illustrates well this point by showing that the pure judgment of taste presupposes that the intuition of a beautiful form produces an agreement of free play between imagination and understanding. But not only that, this agreement also has an effect on the feeling of pleasure. In this sense, the free but purposeful activity the faculty does not seek to achieve a particular concept of the beautiful object as its ends, but only to maintain the subject in a pleasurable state, a state of lubrication of the faculties. This is why Kant claims that the feeling of pleasure is a feeling of life. Indeed, the dynamic of the faculties in the contemplation of beauty accounts for a circular causality that goes from the free play of the faculties to the feeling of pleasure, and then, through pleasure, back to the free play. For it is precisely through the feeling of pleasure that we become aware of the harmonious play of the faculties, going, so to speak, from the cause to the effect, and from the effect to the cause in a relaxed activity that seeks to preserve itself. Now, the formative power of natural ends is an element that we do not find in the model of the regulative idea. And in this sense, the analogy with the organism enriches this last model, since it allows us to account for a capacity analogous to that of a formative force in the system of the faculties. This can be seen in the fact that reason, in its broader sense, can introduce certain kind of order into a multiplicity that does not have it in itself. An example of this is the fact that the higher faculties of cognition, understanding, judgment, and reason can introduce order by means of the respective a priori principles to the empirical diversity represented by the sensibility, the feeling of pleasure, and the will, respectively. The empirical multiplicity that these faculties provide could not be unified if we did not admit the formative power that a priori principles of the higher faculties of cognition presuppose. To sum up, the mind as a system possessed a priori principles capable of giving a certain kind of order or legality to the empirically determinable in it, a capacity which brings out the vital element present in the mind and which can enrich our understanding of the systematic unity we observe in the regulative idea. And while the regulative idea proceeds as if the mind were a substance with accidents, the organic teleological model proceeds as if we were thinking of a natural end, that is, a special kind of substance, a living one. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Now we have comments by Juan Vargas to this paper. Juan Vargas is Bachelor of Philosophy from the Catholic University of Chile. He's currently studying for a master's degree in philosophy at the University Diego Portales, and his main interest is classical German philosophy, Hegel and Kant. He is now working on a thesis on Hegel's reception of the transcendental unity of a perception. So please, Juan.
Okay. Can you hear me well or not? Yes. So thank you very much, Hernan. Do you need me to share the commentary?
If you want, you can share it. Yeah.
Okay. I'll do that. That's fine. Yeah. I'm projecting. Can you read it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I'll stick in to read just to not exceed the time. Okay, I'll just start. In this brief comment, I would like to share some questions that arose for me from reading Alejandra Bar's thesis. Due to time constraints, I will limit myself to presenting two observations, one relatively internal and concerning the argument of the thesis, and the other from a perspective relatively influenced by post-Kantian philosophy and related to the more general objective. I will begin with the second under the suspicion that this question may be more difficult to articulate intelligibly. I should note in advance that some of my references may be informed by aspects of her work that could not be integrated into the full presentation due to time limitations, although I will try to keep these references to a minimum. So Alejandra presents the problem she aims to solve within the framework of her research in the following terms, both in the first and the third critiques. Kant speaks about the prospect of tracing a common origin or bringing the various faculties of the mind to a possible unity. Alejandra wisely identifies two candidate models for addressing this task, the one provided by the regulative idea of the soul, and the one that Kant conceives under the notion of the formative power in his third critique. She astutely dismisses the first model, arguing that the relata brought to unity through this concept of reason are, according to Kant, phenomena related to the internal sense, not faculties. The second, however, proves to be more suitable. In particular, it is more favorable because it allows for various dimensions more or less linked to what we might call vitality or organicity, thereby challenging the mandatory recalls to the concept of substance, and with it mechanical causality as the regulative resource from which to think about the unity of the subject, a reference that seems unavoidable whether at the level of the idea of the soul or at the more appropriate level of formative power. My first question is, in a sense, extremely simple. What do we mean by subjectivity here? This question arises from the observation that post-Kantian philosophy, particularly under the names of Schelling and Hegel, undertook the task of thinking about the unity of reason precisely in light of the famous paragraph 76 of Critique of Judgment, that is, to think the unity of reason on the model of an intuitive intellect capable of going from the whole to the parts and vice versa, in a way that mirrors the systematicity of the organism. In other words, post-Kantian philosophy focused on emphasizing one of the two metaphors coined by Kant to think about the systematicity of reason over the other, that of organism over the architectonic. As is well known, in his early stage, Hegel is extremely critical of the way Fichte thought about the unity of understanding and sensitivity, spirit and nature, being and thought, precisely because of his tendency to think reason, I quote him, as nothing but the dead and death-dealing rule of formal unity. I will focus on the second pair. Hegel, following Schelling, reapproaches the inability of Fichtean philosophy to think about the I and the non-I as participants in a unity. In his differentiate, Hegel observes that this split can be posed in terms of sensitivity versus understanding in the theoretical case, and sensitivity versus reason in the practical case. And regarding the solution to the problem, even at this early stage, he again strives to comprehend reason in terms of an organic unity, precisely in the various meanings highlighted by Alejandra, as a systematic organization, as subject to an internal and somewhat circular quote-unquote causality, and as a living unit. I note what seems to me to be the center of Hegel's argument, if contrary to the Fichtean overriding emphasis on the concept of substantiality and causality, we understand reason under the organic model, subjectivity can be comprehended as a unity and not as a mere aggregate of potentially conflicting faculties. Given this Schellingian Hegelian idea, the question that I believe we can pose is, why must the question of the unity of the subject be understood as concerning primarily the unity of the faculties, where for the post-Kantians this same question was related to reason and practically by default returns to the unity of those very faculties? In other words, the theological unity of the subject seems to be a relatively ambiguous concept. It may indicate, for example, the unity of the perception of the internal sense, which seems to adhere to a certain telos in the regulative idea of the soul. It may refer to the unity of the I thing, where the telos enters here as a tendency of sensitivity and imagination to adjust to the loss of understanding, leading its representation to original perception, as has been argued by Rosales and Longenes. It may also be understood as the unity of reason, rethought in the light of the principle of reflective judgment, as post-Kantians did, or it may be conceived in terms of the potential unity of our faculties, as Alejandra does. I admit in advance that the answer to my question may be too trivial. It could simply be pointed out that subjectivity is being understood differently in each case, resolving this ambiguity. But is there not also something relevant in privileging one option over the other? Furthermore, in each of the highlighted cases, the conciliatory strategy is strikingly similar, resorting to the functions of the a priori principle of reflective judgment to understand the unity in terms that cannot be captured without loss by pure reason and its outcomes. This leads me to pose my second question. In the first chapter of the thesis, Andrea presents Alberto Rosales' interpretation of the transcendental deduction of categories as a deduction that evidences a certain intrasubjective teleology. At the cognitive level, the activities corresponding to the lower faculties of sensitivity and imagination are ordered towards the unity of understanding in order to make possible the knowledge of objects. A second unit of facultative and intrasubjective character is analyzed by Andrea in the second chapter, where she revisits the free play of imagination and understanding in a reflective contemplative setting, with express aim of highlighting the self-referential or circular dimension of pure judgment of taste. With this foundation, she moves to analyze the third unity, also facultative, in this case concerning the faculties of the mind, the cognitive faculty, the faculty of desire, and the feeling of pleasure, but now without the restriction that weighed on the previous cases to a well-defined area of mental life, instead referring to the unity of the later, we could say, without qualifications. My question is whether it is perhaps asking too much of the principle of purposiveness, the unity of all these capacities and activities, to the point that in the last case, it comes to figure simultaneously as a principle that presides internally over the activity of one of the relata brought to unity, and also as the principle that regulates its unification with other faculties. Clearly, insofar as the search for unity in each of these cases is a second-order endeavor, we could say that we are attending to a task that activates judgment in a reflective direction, so that resorting to the principle in question seems a reasonable way to deal with the problem. However, for the same reason, it seems to offer a rather poor reason for speaking in a strong sense of the unity of the subject, since its function is conceived by Kant in a regulative and not constitutive, in regulative and not constitutive terms. It is a principle that guides our judgment in the face of a subjective dimension, dynamic, but admittedly not the ontology of subjectivity as such, if I may use this expression. In any case, I admit that these difficulties likely pertain more to my understanding of Kant than to the argument being defended in the work, as from a Kantian perspective, it seems to me a consistent way to engage with the author's philosophy and a persistent way to respond to the question posed by the research which Kant himself left unanswered. That would be it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan. Okay, so we have one more talk, a talk by Professor Marcos Tistel, and yes, I see him. Professor Tistel is professor at the University of Buenos Aires and at the University of Mar del Plata, and he is currently working on a project on Kantian metaphysics, and especially on a project dealing with Kant's late system of metaphysics in Fortschritte der Metaphysik. So, Professor Thisted, please.
Okay. I would like to thank the audience for their presence, and especially Professor Hernan Pringue for the invitation to be part of the Kantian team from Buenos Aires that is participating here in this beautiful virtual Kant Congress. I would also like to thank Professor Karin de Boer and Andrew Chinel, and also Professor Luis Felipe Garcia for the organization. I began with the presentation. The present work is part of a broader research project initiated several years ago at the University of Buenos Aires. Its main objective is to characterize Kant's later thought on critical metaphysics, and one of its most relevant goals is the critical review of the Fortschritte der Metaphysik, a fundamental text on this subject during the period covered by the research. Given the limited time available, I will confine my remarks to the following. I will argue not only for the significance, but also for the feasibility of conducting a critical review of the current edition of the Fortschritte, which in its structural features is the same as the Academy version by Gerhard Lehmann in 1942, which in turn reflects with few modifications the original edition by Friedrich Ring in 1804. Strictly speaking, my goal is even more limited. I will attempt to show the well-founded reasons why we may suspect that something is amiss in the current edition of the Fortschritte, and why, if we want to recover this late work of Kant, it is essential to reopen the case regarding its composition. For obvious reasons, I will not address the issue in its entirety, but will focus on a single compositional anomaly affecting the Fortschritte edition, which was referred to by de Vleschauer as, I quote, the problem of the duplication of the introduction. End of quotation. Before I begin the specific task I have set myself, let me briefly remind you of some general points about the Fortschritte. The posthumous work is composed from the edition of 3 manuscripts, written by Kant between approximately 1792 to 1795, in response to a prize proposed a few years earlier by the Berlin Academy of Science, whose explicit aim was to respond to the Preisfrage posed in this competition. The long title of the work literally takes up the challenge. I quote, on the question proposed by the Royal Academy of Science of Berlin for the year 71, what real progress has metaphysics made in Germany since the time of Leibniz and Wolff? End of quotation. The exact date on which the manuscripts were delivered by Kant to Ring, as well as the purpose for which they were entrusted to him, cannot be established with absolute certainty. Despite the anomalies in composition and writing that it exhibits, to which Ring himself refers in the foreword of the work, the publication saw the light in 1804, just a few months after the philosopher's death. The academic edition appeared much later and incorporates numerous addenda proposed in the various re-editions of Kant's texts. Its most notable contribution is the inclusion of the lost letter related, or better said, supposedly related in most cases, to the Fortschritte. There are no substantial modifications from Ring's edition, and the critical apparatus is not significant. The main and most recent systematic work on the problem of the composition of the Fortschritte is now approaching half a century. In it, de Vleschauer carefully enumerates and analyzes the numerous anomalies of the work, but his effort seems to focus on reconstructing the genetic process of the work's composition. Ultimately, this did not lead to any major modification of the topic. Subsequent editions of the work, including translation into another language, among which the Spanish version by Caimi and the French version by Grandjean stand out, have not significantly altered the structural composition of the work. The lack of significantly modifications is understandable. The disappearance of the original manuscripts has acted as a true limit to attempts in this direction, as we shall see, and according to our divergent point of view on this matter, the absence of material basis for conducting a critical review of the edition of the Fortschritt complicates the task, but does not make it impossible. In place of the missing manuscripts, a detailed study of the text itself, considering its nature, the fact that it is a work of circumstance, its context, its rhetorical devices, as well as its argumentative and conceptual structure, still offer us clues for this task. Now, let us proceed to the analysis of the specific problem, the duplication of the Fortschritt's introduction. Among the various editorial and compositional anomalies of the Fortschritte der Metaphysik, one stands out for its significance and impact on the assessment of the entire work, the existence of two versions of the opening chapter, the introduction. According to Ring, one version was placed in the first manuscript and the other in the third. The question then arose, which of these should be placed at the beginning as the official version and which should be relegated to the appendices of the work? To resolve this difficulty, Ring proposed a wise criterion. He would consider the official version to be one that showed greater consistency and harmony with the rest of the section of the work, while relegating to the first appendix the one that, though better articulated internally, did not maintain coherence with the whole text. Thus, Ring chose as the official version the introduction from the first manuscript, hereafter referred to as Introduction M1, which occupies page 259 and 264 of the academic edition, and archived the introduction from the third manuscript, hereafter Introduction M3, which occupies page 315, 300 to 320 of the academic edition in the appendix. This is how the work is arranged today. The same text we read, analyze, and interpret. However, a careful reading of Introduction M3 presents the Fortschritte der Metaphysik researchers with an enigma. Indeed, as I will show below, the rhetorical, conceptual, and argumentative elements arranged in this version are not only entirely coherent in themselves, but they also harmonize perfectly, or almost, with the other sections of the work. It is difficult to understand, then, considering Ring's stated criterion of coherence, why Introduction M3 was moved to the appendix. We will return to this issue at the end of the presentation. Let us now proceed without further delay to the analysis of Introduction M3, the neglected version of the Fortschritte's introduction. It is worth recalling that we are dealing with a work of circumstance, the academic competition whose task asked about, I quote, the progress of metaphysics in Germany since the time of Leibniz and Wolff, end of quotation. For this reason, the brief paragraph that opened Introduction M3 serves two essential functions for the overall understanding of Kant's account. on the one hand, to interpret the meaning of the academic task from the perspective of critical philosophy, transplant it into Kant's forma mentis, and translate it into his technical terminology, and on the other hand, to anticipate the rhetorical and argumentative course of Kant's response to this Aufgabe. To make it easier to follow my explanation, I will briefly quote the text mentioned based on Peter Heath's translations. I have made some short modifications in particularly significant technical terms. I quote, "The task proposed by the Royal Academy of Science tacitly contains two questions within it. First, whether metaphysics, from time immemorial until immediately after the days of Leibniz and Wolff, has taken even a single step in what constitutes its true purpose and the ground of its existence. For only if has occurred can we ask about the further progress that it might have made subsequent to a certain point in time. The second question is whether the supposed progress of metaphysics are real." End of quotation. A first point is Kant's subtle irony. Faced with academic task which exude dogmatism, our philosophy argues that is inadvertently a complex question that must be broken down into two distinct issues for differentiated treatment. The first of this question alludes rhetorically through the device of the distinction between Schritt and Fortschritt to the relation of precedence between transcendental philosophy and metaphysics proper. The second, through the suggestive choice of the word real, refers to the critical demand to exhibit the objective reality, objektive Realität, of the concepts of metaphysics proper, that is, of the concept of the supersensible. Let us examine this in a little more detail. The first question maintains that one must first establish what the steps, Schritte, are that precede metaphysics proper and that have been taken in that direction before addressing the problem of the progress, Fortschritte, of metaphysics, which is the topic for which the academic task is asking. This relationship of precedence of transcendental philosophy with respect to metaphysics proper is conceptualized as a means-end relationship and even as a form-matter relationship. Indeed, Kant argues that transcendental philosophy, defined as the system of all pure rational knowledge of things through concept, is a quotation, must be considered a study of the form or method of metaphysics, and that, as such, it must be considered a mere means, although indispensable, if one aspires to found a metaphysic as a science and not to remain in mere natural disposition to metaphysics or to fall into dogmatic metaphysics. For its part, metaphysics proper, defined as, I quote, a science of progressing from the knowledge of sensible to that of supersensible, end of quotation, which is derived from transcendental philosophy, deals with the matter, the practical dogmatic knowledge of the supersensible, and therefore with the true ultimate end that reason pursues with it. A closer look at the rest of Kant's work can confirm with greater accuracy than expected that the proposal Kant introduced in the introduction M3 anticipates the main features of the structure of the Fortschritte der Metaphysik. Indeed, let us see in the first place the impressive consistency that exists between the introduction M3, I emphasize M3, not M1. And the section called Treatise Abhandlung M1 placed immediately after the introduction M1. I quote, "The solution of the problem in hand can be divided into two sections, of which one deals with the formal in reasons procedure for elaboration metaphysics as a theoretical science, while the other derives from the procedure, the material, the final aim that reason has in view with metaphysics, whether that aim be achieved or not. The first part will therefore present merely the step towards metaphysics, treated sur metaphysique, that have lately been taken. The second, the progress of metaphysics, for treated their metaphysics, itself in the field of pure reason. The first contains the current state of transcendental philosophy, the second that of metaphysics proper." End of quotation. Here, we see how the equivalences we had identified in the introduction M3 are reiterated and indeed presented in a more concise and precise manner. In fact, in the treatise, it is established that section 1 will develop the formal method of pure reason for the elaboration of metaphysics. It is the current state of transcendental philosophy, which contains, I quote, "the most recent step toward metaphysics that have taken place," end of quotation, and that section 2 will derive from that method the material that is, I quote, "the current state of metaphysics, properly speaking. It is the progress of metaphysics itself in the field of pure reason," end of quotation. And we will see that this came anticipated by the introduction M3 and then expressed more precisely by the treatise is verified by a quick inspection of the structure of the two main sections of the work. Indeed, the first section presents, we are now in the first section, presents an original history of transcendental philosophy scanned in 3 successive steps, Schritte, towards metaphysics. No, the steps are the Schritte. The first step, I quote, "The first step to have been undertaken in this investigation of reason is the distinction of analytic from synthetic judgment generally." End of quotation. Second, I quote, "The second step is simply to have posed the question, how are synthetic a priori judgment possible?" End of quotation. And ending, I quote, "The third step is the problem, how is an a priori knowledge possible from synthetic judgment?" End of quotation. And finally, the second section, presents the progress of metaphysics divided into 3 stages, Stadien auf Deutsch. I quote, "First into that of theoretico-dogmatic advance, the first stage called doctrine of science. Second stage into that of skeptical stasis, the second stage naming the doctrine of doubt. And third, into that of the practical dogmatic completion of its course and the arrival of metaphysics at its final goal, the third stage, the doctrine of wisdom." End of quotation of the second section. These 3 stages of pure reason, which treat metaphysics according to the end pursued by reason in it, are derived entirely from transcendental philosophy following the plan of the introduction M3. Having reached this point in the analysis of the first question, in which Kant had divided the academic task, it is convenient to pause briefly in the exposition and take a retrospective look at the result achieved so far. The study of the first of the 2 questions, into which Kant separated the academic task, allow us to recognize a play on words, the distinction between Schritte and Fortschritte, with which Kant anticipates the structural division of his work and its internal structure. The distinction between transcendental philosophy, which is expounded in 3 steps toward metaphysics, and metaphysics proper, which exhibits the progress of knowledge from the sensible to the supersensible in 3 stages of pure reason. Perhaps some of you already share with me the unease that I experienced when advancing in the study of the Fortschritte der Metaphysics, starting from the forgotten version of the introduction M3. Sorry, a moment. It is worth remembering that Kant had divided the academic task into 2 questions. The first has already been sufficiently studied. The second concerned the reality of the progress made in metaphysics. Given the surprising result achieved with the first of the questions, I also wondered whether the second part fulfilled any clarifying function regarding the structure of the work, and the result renewed my perplexity. In the first place, to what does Kant refer when he demands that the reality of the alleged progress of metaphysics for which the academy asks be proven? The choice of the word réel of Deutsch not only refers to the French original enunciation of the task, but very especially to the critical concept through which the second issue must be settled, the objective reality, objective Realität, of metaphysical concepts. In effect, Kant tries to defeat his adversary on this plane as well, since, as we well know, the impossibility of demonstrating such objective reality from a speculative perspective is one of the main arguments built by Kant against Leibniz-Wolffian metaphysics. And indeed, Kant used this technical term of critical philosophy, the concept of objective reality, as part of his polemic in a very important and final section of the Fortschritte der Metaphysik, the resolution of the problem posed by the academy. In fact, the first part of this section aims to show, past construing, how it is possible from a critical perspective to exhibit the objective reality of the concept of the supersensible in the practical dogmatical knowledge corresponding to each of the 3 phases, Stufen, of the doctrine of wisdom: moral theology, moral teleology or cosmology, and 3, moral psychology. The second part of this resolution is concerned, past student, with showing the failure of Leibniz-Wolffian metaphysics in each of these speculative disciplines. In conclusion, if we consider the 2 central themes that the introduction M3 deals with, we can see that they foreshadow the general structure of the Fortschritte der Metaphysik with a surprising degree of coherence between the different parts that make up Kant's memory, to such an extent that, thanks to it, it gives the impression that we are not, as Max Wundt claimed, facing a mere aggregate of texts of unequal value, or even, as de Bleschauer affirmed, facing a canevas, but rather facing a work in the full sense of the term, although unfinished. My purpose in this presentation was not to convince you of this inevitable provisional result of my research, but rather of the possibility of reopening the case of the composition of the Fortschritte der Metaphysik, even though we do not have the original manuscript in our possession. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. So now we have, I think, plenty of time for discussion. Maybe we may begin by going back to the question posed by the two commentaries, by the commentary by Martin and by Juan regarding the first two conferences, and with this we may open the discussion for all. I don't know if Laura, do you have anything to say to this objection or observation regarding the synthetic character of the method in according to Caimi's interpretation?
Well, yes, I can briefly sketch an answer to the three questions he posed. I will start with, I think was the second one in relation to the problem of metaphysics. And then I have like 3 points to make. The first one is Caimi has a book on this issue, on the progress of metaphysics, so he deals with this topic. Secondly, that one interesting aspect of Caimi's reading is that he integrates, he has like a coherent, let's say, reading of the whole section. So he also uses the problem of method as a guiding thread to read also the dialectics. So for instance, in his studies of the dialectic, he also thinks that the problem of method is like the guiding thread. And third, one of the interesting aspects that I found in Caimi's reading on this issue is that Caimi highlights, in one of his articles, he highlights the relevance of infinite judgments for the possibility of metaphysics, and more particularly for the possibility of a theoretical theology. So he has like 2 articles on this issue. One is on the possibility of infinite judgments, and the other one, I don't remember which was the topic. It wasn't on theology itself, but where he shows how infinite judgments could serve as a key or a clue for the possibility, for instance, of a transcendental theoretical theology. So this is on the possibility of, on the problem of metaphysics. Then on the problem of method in post-Kantianism, when I work with neo-Kantianism, and one of the theses of my reading is that neo-Kantians particularly use the problem of Nator mainly uses synthetic method in his works. And for my arguments, I use Caimi's interpretation of what the synthetic method is. So it has a highly relevance for my reading of neo-Kantians too. And in the case of Maimon, I think the clue there to understand this problem is the particular distinction of quid fury and quid facti that Maimon does for understanding the problem of method, and the way in which by this he reconstructs many aspects of the system, but particularly the distinction between sensibility and understanding, where he found like there is no heterogeneity between these faculties. And in the case of Fichte, I don't know really, because I haven't worked with Fichte, but I will check this. And in relation to the first question, in relation to the synthetic nature of, I think that was your question, that the method is synthetic, well, what about the object? I think then the clue is not the synthetic nature of the object, but the organic nature of nature. That is to say, the methodological method is allowed, or we use the synthetical method because reason has an organic nature, and therefore the clarification on analysis of each element can lead to the recognition of another one. So in my opinion, it's not the action of synthesis of the object, but the organic nature. And this, for instance, can be seen, for example, in the case of transcendental and aesthetic, the object there is sensibility, which is not active, there is no synthesis, it's completely passive, there's no synthesis involved, but however, we apply a synthetic method there too. Well, these are my answers, like briefly sketch, we can continue talking about it later too.
Thank you very much. So I don't know, Alejandra, if you have something to say regarding one observation on the notion of subjectivity.
Yes, if I understand correctly, what Juan has to say about my presentation, it seems to me that what I'm trying to present is critical account of subjectivity, so to speak. This taking into account that it is the a priori principles of the faculties that allow us to speak of the system of the faculties as teleological organized unity, although only in a regulative sense. I understand that this can be a little, I don't know how Juan put it, disappointing, but if we think it otherwise, we would be transgressing the limits imposed in the paralogisms chapter, attributing objective reality to the subject and its faculty. So that is why I am thinking of a critical account of subjectivity. In regard to the post-Kantian developments of this subject, it seems to me, I'm not an expert of post-Kantian philosophy, but it seems to me that such efforts would exceed the epistemological limits imposed by transcendental philosophy. So at the end, these efforts would turn the subject into a kind of object, and that is not allowed by transcendental philosophy. It's something else, I think. I hope to answer Juan's questions.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. We have a question by Professor Croitoru. I saw your hand.
Yes, thank you. A question that is to Laura Peregrin. I have seen on the screen that on the text of Mario Caini in the footnote, it was mentioned that in mathematics it's not a knowledge in itself. What did Mario Caini understand by this assertion? Maybe make a distinction between mathematical knowledge and philosophical knowledge from the critique of pure reason, which Kant made in this, but later in the metaphysics of in the natural philosophy, in metaphysics of natural science, he has another more imperative, so to speak, idea on mathematics, that according to which there is no science which does not use mathematics. That is, a science is is science just in some measure it includes mathematics. So what did Mario Caimi intend that by this assertion in the footnote, included in the footnote, that mathematics has not a knowledge?
Well, thank you very much for a question. On the one hand, I would say that what Caimi claims in there is that if we take the concept of knowledge in a strict sense, it involves a reference to intuition, and particularly considering when we need to highlight the difference between thinking and knowing. So the difference between thinking and knowing necessarily involves a reference to empirical intuition, and therefore it is not that it is not required mathematics, but it's not enough so as to talk about knowledge in the strict sense of the word. So I think Mario Caimi's reading is in accord what you have said, because certainly empirical intuition involves a reference to the form of intuition. No, one has. There is a video.
Extend just a little what about prolegomena? Because you involve prolegomena as well as the critical pure reason. What about the mathematics in prolegomena? And what is in Mario Caimi, in Mario Caimi's sense, the difference between prolegomena and the critique of pure reason in this respect in mathematics?
Well, on the one hand, again, to highlight that it's not that there is no mathematics required in knowledge, but that it's not enough to have knowledge in the strict sense, because apart from the reference to the form of intuition, we need to have the reference to what is given and to empirical intuition, to have knowledge in the strict sense on the one hand. On the other one, in the relation to prolegomena, while prolegomena uses an analytic method of approach, so it departs from the fact of that we do have synthetic a priori judgments in mathematics and on physics. Here, when it needs to be shown. Caimi considers too, he has, let's say, a traditional reading of the transcendental exposition, so he considers that the method used in prolegomena is present in the transcendental exposition within the critique of purism. So as to sum up, on the one hand, we do need mathematics to have knowledge, but for itself, it's not knowledge in the strict sense of the word. And on the other hand, the relation with prolegomena is that the method is synthetic, but prolegomena is analytic. And even when within the critique, for instance, in the transcendental exposition, we could have like something like the method used in prolegomena. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Rodica. Nice to see you here.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I don't see any hand up. Yes, I would like to pose another question to Laura, but I don't know if anyone else wants to participate. Luis, okay, Luis, please.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the 3 talks. It was really good, and also the comments. I think it was an excellent session. I have a question for Laura, because so I don't know many of Caimi's texts, and I was wondering whether he has written something on the metaphysical foundations, especially because during your talk, you mentioned very often that he places emphasis on the role of matter in the critique of pure reason and the concept of matter. And Kant has a very maybe different approach to the concept of matter in the metaphysical foundations, where matter is on the one hand an empirically given concept, but on the other hand, something that he tries also to analyze a priori. So I was wondering whether Caimi has any comments on this, on the possible similarities and differences between the way Kant approached the concept of matter in the Critique of Pure Reason and the metaphysical foundations.
Well, Luis, thank you very much for your question. As far as I remember now, I don't remember an article on the metaphysical foundations. However, I found very interesting to understand to relate with the metaphysical foundation, two of his articles. One, his article on the anticipations of perception. It's an early article. And the second one, which is I think the most interesting, is one on the concept of quality, the schema of quality, where he analyzes the concept of quality and the concept of reality too. And there he also studies the concept of matter in a very peculiar way, which I think it could help to make a link to the metaphysical foundations. However, I will search, and if I find one, I will send it to you. However, a mark there would be that when I understand the concept of matter in a, let's say, broad scope, in the sense of the transcendental aesthetic, that is to say, there is no analysis of the concept of matter in a more restricted sense, so as to put it, or from another point of view. Who has an interesting article on this is Claudia Jauregui, of the different concepts of matter within the Critique of Pure Reason. But I can share with you then his article, or I can write now on the chat his comments on the schema of quality and on the anticipation of perception, who I think would help too. And if I remember something on the metaphysical foundations, I will share it to you.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much.
No, thanks very much for your question.
Thank you, Laura. Any other question? Yes, Laura. Well, I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about your way of reading the problem of the synthetic method as you presented in Caimi's interpretation, but transposed to the neo-Kantianism architecture or neo-Kantianism point of view. Specifically, the relationship between the notions of synthetic and genetical, just to go back to the formulation of Martin. Could you please tell us a little more about that?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I know that this is your, in a way, your specially reading of this issue.
Yes, well, as Hernan said, one of the thesis of my reading of Paul Nator is that he uses a synthetical method, and particularly considering the specific way in which Caimi reads the synthetical method. Because on the one hand, Caimi considers that the fact is the fact of reason itself, and in the sake of the as reason is organic, we can employ something as the synthetic method on the one hand. But on the other hand, the synthetic method, as Caimi describes it, and I have already said, also has another interesting aspect. That is, he takes the possibility of experience a certain kind of, let's say, fact, at least as a fact that pushes the investigation forward. That is to say, the possibility of experience is what it needs to be explained. And in this way, is what leads us to continue with the investigation and not to stop, so as to put it. So, in my opinion, Paul Nator particularly uses the same method. He takes the fact of reason as a point of departure. He has certain kind of the fact of experience, not as a fact to start with, but something that pushes the investigation forward, certainly a peculiar concept of experience, but it's what pushes the investigation forward. But the point of departure is also reason itself, in my opinion, and particularly also this method of analyzing the elements of this first fact, and by the clarification of each of them, try to understand which are all the elements of the factors that compose this third element with which we begin the investigation.
So if I understand you correctly, so you are claiming that there are, let me put it in this way, two different facts. So the fact of reasons on the one hand, and the fact of experience or of scientific knowledge on the other hand. That is your...
Yes, but that's what happens also in the critique of pure reason at a certain point. That is to say, we have the fact, the first fact, as Caimi says, for instance, let's say the fact of a perception in the deduction. But however, we have another fact, that is the possibility of experience. The possibility of experience is what, for instance, when we are in the chapter of, in the end of the deduction, says, well, you cannot stop here. You need, for instance, have an schematism that explains the relationship between concept and intuitions. I mean, it's what makes us follow the investigation. I mean, that's to say, you cannot stop. You need to continue investigating, but you still cannot explain what you're supposed to explain. That is to say, the possibility of experience. So at a certain point, also within the critique of pure reason, the possibility of experience works as a certain kind, not as a fact, as a point of departure, as in prolegomena, but something, let's say, as a horizon, which give us the idea that you cannot stop in there. You need to follow the investigation. So that's what I was saying when I said, like, pushing the investigation forward. So while it's not a fact in the sense that we have a fact in the prolegomena, however, it's still a fact in the sense that it commands us to continue the investigation up to a certain point. So in my opinion, the concept of experience in neo-Kantianism plays the same role as experience plays within the critique of pure reason, as a certain kind of fact.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, any other questions? Well, maybe I may pose another one. This time regarding Marco's thesis on the third introduction, or the M3 introduction of the Fortschritte. But my question is really simple. What about the M1 introduction? According to your consideration on this new interpretation or a new rearrangement of the whole manuscript, what place should we give to this one introduction? Because now, what are we supposed to do with this one? What is the role, if any, of this introduction? Not just the three, because I think that your point is pretty convincing regarding the role of this part of the manuscript. But what about the part which is now at the very beginning, which is now considered the real introduction of the manuscript?
Thank you. About this question, for me is obviously a very important question. It's natural to adapting what we can do with the introduction one. This is my idea. In first time, it's important not to return to the genealogical process of the Blechauer. It's impossible to know what Kant thought about this text. And if we haven't the manuscripts, it's impossible to understand very well what Ring made with this edition, etc. So we have only the text published by Ring and a few indication. But in first time, the introduction one, it's very important because the interpretation that Kant gives about the task, about the Aufgabe, gives us an idea about another concept of Fortschritte, that is the concept of Fortschritte in a systematic way. The second section, in which Kant developed the metaphysics proper, that is the three stages of metaphysics, it's founded in a systematic progress. Is the reason itself which progress the sensible knowledge to the supersensible knowledge. In this case, the introduction one is very important to understand what alternative idea of progress, not historical progress, but systematical progress, have Kant in mind. This is the importance of the introduction one. So we do not relegate it again, this introduction. But the problem is with the category, two terms that are very confused in the first introduction. That is, Kant speak about the step of metaphysics there in the introduction one, the step of metaphysics and the stage of philosophy. That is, confuse all the categories that in the develop of the first and second section are very clear. One read introduction first, so we cannot use introduction 1 as a guide for the structure of the Kant Fortschritte. It is only, for me, it's only the concept of the Fortschritte, the systematic concept of Fortschritte, which is important in this very first section. So I think that it's important to introduce the idea of a critical edition of Fortschritte der Metaphysik. It is not important. It is not correct for me replace first introduction 3, introduction 1 with introduction 3, and then introduction 1 to the appendix again. No, it's not good. That. So what can we do? Okay, introduction 3 is the most important because it has the structure, but introduction 3 it's also important because for me genial idea of Kant that define metaphysics as progress from the sensible to the supersensible is well explained there. So for me the better is have the two versions of English a la vista and disposed at the same time, and a good explanation, obviously. So that is my idea.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, any other questions? No. Oh, yes. Professor Eman, please.
This is just a very simple question for Marcos. Do you know if these suggestions of yours will be taken up in the new Academy edition, or are you in charge of that? Or are you simply going to do something on your own that does more with the text?
You're muted, Marcos. We cannot hear you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor. I hope that it's important for the Academy edition, but I don't know the ways from. I proposed this modification years ago in a Congress, and also I have my book in coming soon, but I don't know what ways direct to the Academy editors. But I think that is important because today, if we continue with the present edition, we not obviously think that is not work in the full sense of the meaning, and I think the bigger problem of the interpretation of Fortschritte is that everybody says take a part independently of the whole, and say here Kant say that the metaphysics is etc., 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 and another say no, the metaphysics is this another idea, and these ideas are in many times are contradictory between each other. So the possibility of having a full text, a structured text of the Kantian Fortschritte der Metaphysik controls this the different interpretation and conducts from the what Kant had have in mind when he writes this text. So for me, it's a hope, but I don't know if it's possible to convince and in which way the academic people for this change. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Well, I think we are coming to the end of our meeting, no, Luis? Do you?
Yes, so thank you so much for this wonderful session. I think it was very insightful, and we'll have the recording available on YouTube and on our website, so we can check again all the talks. I will do it myself because it was really good. And I will just post here on the chat the schedule of the Congress. So the next session will be in about 2 weeks, and it will be about Kant's reception in Africa. So we are looking forward to this session as well. And of course, you will receive reminders from me in the next few days about this. So thank you so much, Hanan, for putting the session together and for bringing Argentina and Chile together into this Kant session. So I think it was very good for all of us. And look forward to seeing you soon again. And please stay online. I'll just stop the recording now.